Okay, darling, let's go. Oh, hold on. I think I forgot something. Just give me a sec.
Wait. What did you forget?
I forgot my umbrella, darling.
But we don't need it.
How come we don't need it?
Because this
It's so sunny outside. How on earth you don't need an umbrella?
But we have shade. So back in September last year, the BBC released an article about Singapore's shade. Namely, that it is a city obsessed with shade. But how did this come to be? Well, thinking about it, it's the natural solution to the intense sun and rain that comes down upon this little island nation. This love for shade actually began with the shophouses. The 5-foot way in these shophouses are probably perhaps the first urban approach to this need of shade. And it is a remnant from Singapore's early days as a British colony. As you can see, every one of these houses, noticeably, has a small shaded area right at its doorstep. And well, this was mandated to be, as the name suggests, 5 feet wide. And when connected, these form a continuous shaded pathway, bringing you comfortably to wherever you want to go. Yet, as we can see, it's not a lot of space. It did serve its purpose though. And to this day, walking along the shophouse 5-foot way, you can feel that it's a relatively shaded path you can take. Just mind the misaligned tiny gaps you will sometimes see. Because after all, back in the day, regulations were a lot more relaxed. And as Singapore began to modernize going into the 20th century, these relatively newer buildings still took this into consideration. As you can see of these photos of the pre-war social housing flats in Tiong Bahru, you still have these shelter pathways built into these buildings. And because you can also see other more public buildings as well, such as the National Design Centre, which was actually the former St. Anthony's Convent. And these kind of Art Deco buildings still incorporated these external shaded walkways into their design. Although, as freestanding buildings, you still need an umbrella to cross into the next sheltered building. Through the decades, as Singapore continued to develop, all these newer buildings all had their own take on this 5-foot way. After independence in 1965, the new modernist developments incorporated this fundamental concept into their design. These iconic developments from the early days of Singapore's independence still kept this critical piece of Singapore infrastructure. For example, People's Park Complex, People's Park Shopping Centre, and many other, as you can see, modernist buildings from the early days of Singapore's independence. And actually, this design was a key part of Singapore's post-independence design approach. Many of these early architects, in the wake of independence from colonial rulers, wanted to find and express their newfound identity in architecture. With a multi-ethnic nation that had no single cultural monolith to draw from, these designers looked to responding to the local climate as one of the key design factors. No doubt, the immediate conclusion to tropical weather is the provision of shade around the outdoor areas. Even in the 1980s, we still have this 5-foot way of shophouses. And well, it exists in the HDB shophouses. These new 5-foot ways, although much larger than 5 foot now, combined with the void decks, help to create a lot of continuous shade that links these various spaces together. But now, moving into the 21st century, what kind of shading do we have? And well, it has diversified quite a bit. For example, here in Orchard MRT, one solution was to connect everything underground. This actually works quite well for an underground MRT station, with various retail shops found underground in these connections. And this is perhaps the most comfortable option, since everything is air-conditioned. Just make sure you know which of the 14 exits connects to your destination. And remember how small the 5-foot way of the shophouses of the early days were? Well, in places like Chinatown and Clarke Quay, much larger structures have taken over the role of shelter in these two districts. Chinatown has a rather generic giant shelter, whereas Clarke Quay is the more iconic looking one, and they were actually called Angels back in the day when they were installed in the early 2000s. You can almost think of these as giant umbrellas, and it is quite important if you want to turn these dense tight streets into pedestrianised shopping zones. These mega ships seem to be quite popular as well in newer developments. For example, Guaco Midtown, Tanjong Pagar, etc. The sheer size of this provides shade over a large public space, while still ensuring that ample airflow still passes through. It's also an important factor to incorporate ventilation and fans within these developments, since what's the point of shading if you're going to feel hot anyway? And in the past decade, these newer, simpler walkway shelters have taken over most of the outdoor paths in Singapore. Despite being very simple looking, these have in fact a lot of considerations taken into the design. Its height and width are very strictly stipulated, with very specific requirements to ensure that people underneath get enough shelter despite the most adverse weather conditions, since rain doesn't always fall straight down. And you can find this almost anywhere in Singapore nowadays, especially in the hotbeds of residential areas. Of course, in some of these areas, they even developed to the point where it ends up having a nice green roof to make it integrated into what we call this garden city concept. And speaking of garden city, we can take a look at the original shelters of this region. In Singapore, we have different species of tall, shade-providing trees. NPark's website actually covers some of these quite well. From the rain tree, the Samanaya saman, to the angsana tree, also called the Nava tree or Pterocarpus indicus. These are in fact actually nature's original ways of providing shade for people living in this hot climate. And looking around, we can actually still see some of these trees providing this shade to some extent and becoming its own icons in a sense. For example, in SMU City Campus Green, we can see a group of large shade-providing trees that help create a nice shaded outdoor learning environment. And near Cashew MRT, we can see this magnificent giant rain tree that still provides a big amount of shade to this area around, though of course it has been supplemented by the sheltered linkways. And fun fact, some of these trees are not even natives to this island. The rain tree, the Samanaya saman, actually came from the Americas, while the angsana tree, Pterocarpus indicus, came from other countries in Southeast Asia. And notably, both were actually introduced to the island by, as you can guess, the British. So looking at this historical photo, you can actually see the angsana trees lining up the padang, although many of these trees will later be affected by the fusarium wilt or angsana wilt. Yet, as you can see, the trees were clearly brought by the British to create these nice shaded boulevards for themselves. Even so, these trees actually play a key role today in providing shades to our public spaces. And perhaps in the near future, the government and developers will perhaps start to make use of these trees more often. Because as practical as these sheltered linkways and 5-foot ways are, it's always nice to have an extra natural shading around where we walk. And in line with the city in the garden concept, I really do feel that it's much nicer to have trees adding shade to the sheltered linkways. Well, that's the end of this video. And this will be the first of our new series where we dive into the design of Singapore. I hope you enjoyed it and see you next time. Bye.